Terroir. I'm Simon Jacob, your host for this episode from Jerusalem. Before we get started, I ask that wherever you are, please take a moment and pray for the safety of our soldiers and the safe return of all of our hostages. Welcome to the Kosher Terroir, the podcast that uncorks the world of kosher wine. One bottle, one story at a time. Today, we're joined by Joshua London, a seasoned wine and spirits writer with a deep knowledge of the global kosher wine scene. Originally from California, Joshua has written extensively on wines, spirits, and cocktails for top publications, offering expert insight into what makes a great kosher vintage. In this episode, we explore the evolution of the kosher wine market, emerging trends, and what sets certain wines apart. If you love discovering new wines, expanding your palate, and diving deep into the craftsmanship behind every bottle, you're in the right place. So pour yourself a glass, settle in, and let's explore the kosher terroir. Welcome to the kosher terroir, Josh. It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about how you got into wine. And what you're doing now. But let's start from the beginning. How did you get into this?
Oh gosh, so it feels like many lifetimes ago now, but so I'm originally from Northern California, from Sacramento.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, small film community.
Sure.
You may recall.
Do you know Steve Fishbein?
Yeah. When we first met, we did a little bit of this Jewish geography, but it was right at the start of the Rothschild dinner thing in New York.
Right, in New York.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Steve, in fact, even many more moons ago, the Fishbeins, when they first moved to Sacramento, so my father, Oliver Shalom, who was the chazer, and he was like, "What are you big?" He was a small pond. He was a big fish. He's one of the folks, along with the Rav, who helped Makarev, Steve and Yvette, bring them more into the fold. I remember all the kids growing up.
Wow. Very, very small world. All right. So tell me a little bit about your background. Where did you start? How did you get into wine?
Okay. So as I say, I'm originally from Sacramento, and there were some family friends who were wine lovers and who were decided to sort of roll the dice and have an attempt at making some kosher wine. It was I can't recall off the top of my head now. I think it was Sonoma grapes, but they were making it in Davis, California. Davis,
near
right
UC Davis.
Yeah. In fact, that's where I did my undergrad, was UC Davis, and all of the Israeli wine folk who would come through, if any were Dati, they came to the Sacramento community. That time I met Chicky Rauschberger. I've known the Rauschberger family a long time.
Wow.
From his time there when he was doing the research on the Vushel and all that. At any rate, so friends of the family, you may know, you probably know Yitzi Applebaum.
Sure.
So Yitzi and a few partners did a kosher wine. It's now a pretty mediocre, unremarkable Australian wine, Teal Lake.
Okay.
But when Teal Lake first began, it was a California wine made at Davis. It was Yitzi and Hilda Applebaum, doctors Iseroff and Huntley, married Rivka Iseroff and Art Huntley. And there was one other partner who was not Jewish, whose name escapes me this moment. And back then, this is before the industry was as big and before the kashrus industry was as big and as professionalized. And so basically they would, grab the handful of Shomer Shabbos folks from Sacramento and sort of push them into the winery. My father did, a bunch of people did it. I was in yeshiva high school at the time, but every time I came back, I would be press ganged into the winery. And so I began as a cellar rat, essentially, in a custom crush type facility. The Rav Machshir was a family Rav, Shlomo Rosen, who's now in Chicago. but he was a long time Rav of Sacramento, and I think it was under the OU, although I know I have some old labels, pictures of old labels. But anyway, he was the actual Rav on the ground and essentially the one making it. And it was Pinot Noir. It was actually fabulous. At one point, they did a rosé, a Pinot Blanc, Pinot Rosé, which was also fabulous. Distribution was challenging, and eventually they sold the label to Royal, who then kept the artwork. I think was Rivka. I think she actually drew it. So they kept the name. They kept a version of the artwork. Sold off all the stock. I think through Trader Joe's for like $2. It was like a kosher $2 chuck regionally, very locally. So everyone bought it up, and that was like the wine du jour till it ran out. Then I think it was a year or two of nothing before they moved it to, at the time, Norman's Wines in Australia for like bulk Australian wine. I think they still release stuff in that category, maybe even some reserve. I stopped drinking the Australian teal lake a long time ago, but the original one was actually very nice. So anyway, I caught the bug then.
Wow.
So before I was legal to drink it.
Wow.
And also, so growing up in Northern California, so all the wine personalities that either were in kosher or dabbled or were supportive of kosher was sort of people I got to know. So Ernie Weir, Craig Winchell, Craig even more than Ernie, only because at some stage Ernie sort of upgraded the hashkacha, but there was a brief period where some people drank it, some people didn't, and that kind of thing. But my family, my father, Oliver Shalom, was always very supportive of all of this stuff. There was a mainstream winery in Napa that was owned by the Jewish Ascali family out of Languedoc, and they did a kosher run for a couple of years, Mount Maroma and Mount Madrona, and we used to drink that. This was before.
I remember seeing bottles of that.
It was actually excellent as well. And nothing was that expensive back when. This was also the days when Robert Weinstock was making Weinstock wines himself before he sold it to Royal. And he was actually making fabulous wines. They used to have this Chenin Blanc that was really 6 times better than the price.
Right. I remember them being super quality at a very reasonable price.
Yeah, that's right. And it was a sort of thing, folks in the industry who, again, either weren't themselves from, or maybe not even Jewish, but were highly supportive, were generally supportive. Dan Berger used to write for the LA Times. He used to, give positive reviews. The Cordy brothers, which were supportive of kind of ethnic and other, sort of more out there wines. Cordy had a big influence on a lot of the kosher producers, just by being supportive, helping to open doors, helping to make connections. It was a smaller world, less corporate in many respects. Some of it still is that way in Napa. But anyhow, so I kind of grew up with all that. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I kind of realized how rich the experiences were. And it was many years later that I started writing professionally about it. So I went from California to Israel for a bit, and then back to California. Then graduate school, I went to University of Chicago, and it was while in grad school that I started writing professionally. And basically, I just sort of realized I had a facility for writing that was just slightly better than my peers, but enough. And initially, I was doing mostly politics and stuff like that. But so I had a whole, at the time, my writing was more politics and kind of cultural commentary and that kind of, even though I was a kid, but As I come from the American Jewish school of thought, where everyone in the world is entitled to my opinion. So
I love it.
I'm tempered a bit now, but and even more so by politics. It's a blood sport of a different nature than it was when I was growing up. But anyway, so I became sort of a professional writer. As a sideline, I was always doing other stuff too. And then once I moved to Washington, D.C. after graduate school, and after I was married, which I married my wife in 2002. So it was around 2000, I think 3 or 4, that I first started writing about wine, um, kosher wine and spirits. And there was a local, it became a national thing, but there's a local paper called the Washington Examiner. And now it became a big chain with examiners all over the place. But at that exact moment, it was basically just a local paper. And the wine guy for it, who's Jewish, never wanted to touch anything kosher, whatever. I had met him through someone else, and I asked him, "Oh, what are you going to be reviewing for Passover?" Right? So it's the one time a year when everyone, and he says nothing, and I'm like, "Oh, that's not good." So I contacted the editor, and I said, "Look, I know nominally know the wine guy. I know he's not going to touch it for Passover." I said, "You have a sizable Jewish community. Can I write the piece for Passover?" Sure. So I did. They loved it because they had a regular wine writer, and at the end of the day, there wasn't the market for a regular kosher wine column. I ended up doing a cocktail column, cocktails, spirits, food occasionally for the weekend section. I ended up with a weekly column, and where I was basically doing like storytelling about cocktails, the background, the history, different recipes. There's a handful of cocktails that have their history in DC, and so I would go, sort of like the Army Navy Club, and the photographer would come, and so I was like having fun with it. I was a very tiny, minor, not even celebrity, but a minor figure in the drinks world in DC, very tiny. My stature is almost infinitesimal, but amongst them, they knew me. Um, and then from that, let's see, around the same time, kosherwine.com, which back then was Hungarian Kosher Foods in Chicago. They had just started sort of revamping their website and getting people to do reviews of the wines. And I and my friend Gamliel Kronemer, who's also a wine writer, we started just uploading our notes, of the wines, because it was an easy way to keep track of our notes, without having to be too pretentious about having, notebooks or this or that. It was early days. Well, so in short order, I said, I'm a bit of an insomniac, so when I would have dead time, I would just start uploading these things. All of a sudden, I had something like 500 wines, reviewed across the price spectrum. And so suddenly my name was like, people all over the place would email me out of the blue and say, are you the same one who does this? What would you recommend? Et cetera, et cetera. And Dan Kush, who at the time, the Kush family owned Hungarian Kosher Foods, he ran a Wine of the Month club through Hungarian, through kosherwines.com. And he had a newsletter, and he needed someone to write the newsletter. At some point, and here I don't remember the history, if David Rocca was doing it first or if Rocca took it over from me. I just don't remember. And maybe Rocca knows, but at some point I started writing the newsletter, not under my name, just writing it for them. And for that, I needed to research. I needed to know information about the wineries. And at this stage of the game, the only way there was any information was whether or not the individual winery doing a kosher run had a marketing department and decided to do anything. Royal wasn't on top of it outside of the Herzog label, maybe a couple of Israeli wines. and I was pushing a lot of stuff that I found interesting and that reached the right price point for Kirsch, and that he could get enough supply. And through that, I became very friendly with the Royal Wine Corp marketing people. At some stage, I moved on. I can't remember exactly why I left the newsletter. At some stage, it was, I think, partly maybe we were running out of information on the wines. Like I had sort of tapped the interesting ones, and then Royal didn't have any information, and the wineries. This was early days. The websites weren't so
Prominent,
information
yeah,
heavy.
yeah.
So at some point,
And
I said,
certainly no internet.
yeah. I mean,
The internet was really low.
It was low, right?
Yeah.
It just wasn't as user friendly, certainly as now. And everyone's computers were like dial up or whatever.
Right.
Like everything was slower. And then so let's see. This is probably, I'm making up the times, but it's something like maybe 2009, 2008, 2009, something along those lines. At some stage, my cocktail column came to an end because the editors changed. The Examiner got bought out, became a much larger national thing, and essentially I was dropped. I and a bunch of other people in one fell swoop. And then I started doing some freelance writing. And at some stage, I became the weekly columnist for the Washington Jewish Week, a mantle that our friend, Jules Polonetsky,
sure,
yeah. So Jules now has that column, and he's doing a great job. And Jules is an old neighbor of mine from Potomac. He's a good friend. That's one of his columns. But so I had that column, and then my friend Gamliel Kronemer had a regular gig with the Jewish Week in New York in the print edition, and they were just launching their website, like a food and wine website. And so I started writing heavily for the website. Again, sort of ended up with a weekly column, and periodically also for the print edition. And this was, I don't remember the exact year, but at some stage they began an annual wine magazine, the Crete Pesach thing. And so I became very involved in that. I became a judge a little bit later in the process. The whole competition was basically Yossi Horowitz. I don't know if it was invention. I think it was invention. Either he came up with the idea or he professionalized it for them. I don't remember. He'll tell you. He remembers. But he and City Winery guys, Steve Dorff and folks like that, they began it. Gamliel, my memory of this is he became a judge maybe the second or third year in, and they kept inviting me, but it just wasn't practical. And then by the fourth or fifth year, the publisher said, "We'll pay for you to come up and stay in a hotel." I said, "Okay," and then and then I became a judge. But the whole time I was writing for them. So by the time that just before COVID rolled around, when we finally met in person at that Rothschild dinner in New York, that was probably the height of my very relative name recognition in this niche, and then COVID blew the whole thing up.
Well, it did in some ways and didn't in others because
it evolved. It changed.
It totally evolved.
Yeah.
But
for me, it like my column and like the Jewish Week in New York folded. It's sort of back as an online thing, but all different people. But they never did reach out to me. And I think I never heard of it. I tried emailing the new crew and never heard a thing. So like my regular writing gigs evaporated. And that's when I started doing more online stuff.
What about the link?
So the moment the Jewish Link started up, so Elizabeth Kratz is a longtime friend. I knew her. Actually, I first met her brother who sadly passed a few years ago. He was finishing his PhD at University of Chicago, just as I was entering University of Chicago. And he and his family were friends with my brother, who lives in Chicago. And through Robert, the brother, I met Elizabeth. She was working on Capitol Hill at the time for, I think it was Congressman Pombo. And she was like, had a whole career in politics and, And when I reconnected with her in DC, I and Gamliel and a couple others helped sort of cultivate for her a love of wine. I won't take credit beyond the spark. It's all the rest of it's all her talents. But we used to have very fun wine tastings and stuff in DC. We had a nice little chevre for this shtick. So I've known Elizabeth a long, long time. So when the Jewish Link took over effectively from the Jewish Week, she also always invites me to come up and be a judge. It's just not practical in terms of the distance. But I've been writing for them from day one. Just basically just a magazine. I think she's encouraged me to write much more off and on. I think now she probably has an embarrassment of riches of people who write, which is nice. I've reached that stage where my name seems to be recognized by some. By others, it's more of a sounds familiar, and there's plenty of people who have no idea who I am, which is perfectly fine too.
So, what prompted the move to the UK?
So, COVID was an interesting time period in Washington D.C. So I was living in Potomac, Maryland, sort of a Washington suburb.
Yep.
Lovely community, very nice area, just outside of DC. Well, when COVID struck, the politics of COVID, particularly in DC, was even more toxic than coronavirus. And a lot of different people handled it in many different ways. A handful of people remained level-headed and good, and many panicked and it brought out, shall we say, their worst traits, including, in some cases, people of either nominal or official leadership capacities. Kept saying to Anna, like, look, our jobs are now remote. We can do this from anywhere in the world. Why don't we find some place where A, there's family a little bit closer, and B, maybe we could find Jewish schooling that's not online. My son was essentially eating crayon stage, so to do that remotely is silly. And at that time, the school, because of the politics of Corona, they were talking about, in the early stages, they were talking about, if they ever reopen to, and then like a kindergarten would be 6 feet apart, then you'd have like a little, not quite a cage, but
a plexiglass box.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to pay, close to $30,000 a head for this. This is ridiculous.
Right.
So, and it wasn't until, I want to say it was maybe Shavuos. It was the Chagim of like no guests, no nothing, that helped convince my wife that we did need to move on. And I think it was post Shavuos that she finally said, you know what, this is ridiculous. Also, we didn't know when we'd ever see my in-laws again. Thank God they're in good health, but they're older. And it was like, it just didn't make sense for our kids. It was too, sterile an environment. So finally, we decided to explore the options. We came to England, to London, thinking this would be, maybe a 6-month wait out COVID, essentially. Long story shorter now. Basically, we stayed. We're still here, and it's been a great move for the family. My kids, who don't really remember America, pine for it, but just because it's other. But the only thing that amongst the things that transitioned was professionally. Until that time, my day job was I was a lobbyist for various Jewish groups, Israel lobbying, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And once remote work was no longer the method of the day, that was untenable to maintain that kind of position. I would jump back and forth a little bit, and the January 6th stuff in DC and the politics around that kept the Capitol shut for even longer than Corona. So that allowed me to hang on to that job for a bit. But at some stage, enough. So I let my boss know I wasn't coming back, and we moved on. We've sort of been involved a little bit in the local scene with Kedem Europe, which is like the royal family here, and a couple of the other folks. It's a much smaller market, but it's a vibrant community.
Well, they seem to. I'll tell you something. The Kedem team that has the wine club in the UK and in Europe and what have you.
Wine Club,
The Refined Wine Club. That is really incredibly well run. They always have the best product of any club, any wine club anywhere in the world. I'm always super impressed with them.
Well, they have a fabulous portfolio, as you know. So, for every iteration of the Royal Kedem Herzog family, they have, bar none, the largest kosher portfolio of any one group, and with tremendous variety and some amazing quality. And they had I don't know who invented the club. I don't know which of them came up with it. I believe it's currently run by Yankee Herzog, which is the son of Shia Morris Herzog, who's the head of Kedem Europe. So his son who currently runs it. I don't know if he came up with it or Shia or somebody else, but they run it very, very well. And because of the funny bits, related to the 3-tier system in America, they have a lot of American members because I guess, I don't know if they ship it. I mean, I know they ship it there. I don't know if most of the members get it shipped or if they pick it up as they pass through London for business. But apparently they have a very large subscription base in America. And I guess it's just easier. I mean, so like the Herzog Winery in California has a wine club. But because of the distribution networks, it only makes sense for people who are within certain states or whatever. And so Refined Club is like, I think is the club du jour. So it's it's multiple countries and, and they seem to be very good about just giving people variety and quality. And it's a good operation.
Have you ever tasted non-kosher wine?
Yes.
Okay.
So, some years ago, when I was first sort of becoming professional about it, when I was still in Chicago, I had extensive conversations with Dayan there, passed away, but he, and this was an area of expertise, so wines and related issues. And I actually, from him, I got a heter to taste and spit. The person who gave me the heter was Rav Gedalia Dov Schwartz Zatzal. And so in the early days, I did a lot of educational tasting in educational settings. I would go to a trade show and a lot less these days. I feel like at this stage, I have a pretty well-educated palate in many respects. I still sometimes will taste and spit if it's truly, taste and spit, stam yenam, if it's something I've never had and I've read about it. I want a sense of really what it is, but very sparingly now.
I'm curious because that really frames, questions that I have for you as far as that's concerned. We've just gone through a number of trade shows, specifically in London, KFWE London, and also
the Kosher Wine Show.
Kosher Wine Show. Okay. So anything interesting?
There's lots of great and interesting new stuff. Just to take it first with KFWE, which I think this was like the 19th show maybe, or 20, something like, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was, this was like the third or fourth one I've been to in London, and it was phenomenal, and it was a packed house. I think it was over 1,000 people, but hard to tell a little bit, but really, really packed. And so it's all the Kedem portfolio, but they have some astounding wines coming through. I don't know if you've yet tasted the new winemaker, David Galgazano.
Yeah.
So he's only a couple of years in. I mean, so he's new in the sense that I think this is the first iteration of wines where he's been more in control in terms of his style, breaking free of the formula stuff a bit. So Joe Hurleman, was an unbelievably talented winemaker and a great guy. And so David had real mensch. So David had big shoes to fill, and he's filled them well.
So you're talking about the Yesod?
So actually across the board. So Yesod is like new,
right?
But all of the wines that he makes, which is basically the whole lineup, many of them he's begun to sort of tinker with and make changes. Some of them subtle, some of them a little more so, but they're all like a step up in quality, and it's distinct. You can taste them. Two of the wines in particular that so not as high as the Yesod price wise, but they have a new sort of reserve Chenin Blanc, unbelievable. David, he had a vision, to take the Chenin that they grow there, and just kind of take it to a different place. So it's still California. It's still distinctly a New World wine, but he had in mind essentially to go to the Loire, to Savennières, which is a particular region that makes a very particular style of Chenin, and he's basically channeled it in ways that are just astounding. The wine is really good. I had previously Joseph Herzog, or Matti Herzog from the winery, had come through London and they did a tasting. So I had sort of tasted all the Yesods and the Chenin and the Reserve Pinot, which is also incredibly good, and a handful of others. But to taste them again at KFWE, and in some instances, like with the Chenin, they do both the Mavushal and non-Mavushal, and I was able to kind of taste them back to back. Just an amazing wine. I really, I think if people give it a chance, they'll fall in love with it. It's just, there's a complexity, a weight in the mouth, so unbelievably food friendly. And it's still distinctly California, but very much channeling the soul of Loire, of Savennières. And I think it's a little bit pricey, but I think it'll probably become my house white, because it's just, to me, it's really astoundingly good. The Yesods are amazing, but they're so young. I mean, frankly,
it's hard to taste them.
Several years. Yeah, right now they're just a bit too inky. The Pinot, the Sonoma Pinot, they had the Reserve, excellent. Their sort of champagne method bubbly is even better now than the previous. So I like across the board Herzog, they get better every year generally, but they're even better. I think is a real qualitative step up. So all those were good. There was a whole variety of upscale French and mid-level French that were excellent. Probably the one that got the most attention is the Philippe Lahardy line of Burgundies.
Mm-hmm. People are hot on Burgundies right now because we've been Burgundy starved for so long that
and now there's an embarrassment of riches. And the Lahardy wines are excellent, really outstanding. They had a Clos of Vougeot, which is super expensive, but drinking incredibly well now, but will get much better. But to me, the Alos Corton that they had, exceptional right now. Again, a bit pricey, but if you can afford it, really fab. The base level Burgundy, um, I thought was excellent. For the money, I actually prefer that to the Premier Cru version of it. Uh, with a little bit of time in bottle, that'll reverse, and the Premier Cru will become better. But in terms of drinking right now, the quote unquote bog standard one, fab, really really good. Um, really exciting Drapier champagne. They released a vintage champagne. Um, really really nice. It's a bit different from if you're into that champagne house, which I love, but I love all champagne, but but I do love Drapier, and Michel, a real mensch, his son Hugo. It's a really good family. They've been, in general, they've been going for low dosage, drier. And this I think it was 2018 vintage is a bit higher dosage than we've seen from them of late. So depending on your palate, it may come across as a little bit sweeter than you've come to expect from them. Which some people tasted it at KFWE and were like, sweet. It's not a sweet wine, but it's a very relative thing.
Yeah.
But
I
I
think that
thought
that'll actually sell better, to be quite honest. I
it
think there's
probably
a
will.
group of people who are really adverse to any type of sweetness coming across the palate, but in the general public, I think the general public it will move much better than
I
the
tend to
absolute
agree.
dry.
And it's funny. That just as an aside, and if I'm boring, you'll let me
You're
know.
not. Yeah.
Just as an aside, so there's a. This is not just kosher, right? Across the wine world, there is a strong bias by aficionado types, wine mavens, against sweetness in wine, unless it's dafka, a dessert wine like
Yeah.
a Sauterne or whatever. And it's just it's not right and it's not fair. I say not right because that's not, to me, that's not how you approach wine. That's not what it's about. Um, uh, it's about the grapes giving you the best that they can give you. In some cases, you do want to see it across the style range. Riesling, it's a shame that increasingly nobody wants any sweet Riesling. Um, I mean, I love dry Riesling. Don't get me wrong. I love a sweet Riesling, and I love every gradation of the Riesling.
Mm-hmm.
It's and Chenin Blanc is the same. I love every gradation, and so there are some wines where a certain natural sweetness is not just acceptable; it's proper, right? And to convince people that if they like sweet, that they're unsophisticated. It's just not fair to me. It's just not, and it's because it has nothing to do. It's nothing to do with sophistication or lack of sophistication. It's a preference. It's a taste preference,
It's a
and
subjective preference.
it's very subjective. And not that long ago, in the big scheme of things, even the top wines of the world, even recognized names that are now nobody would ever think, like Cheval Blanc, nobody would ever think of as a sweet wine. Not that long ago, high residual sweetness was the fashion.
Right.
And so across Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Rhine, you had many more wines that to modern palates would be too sweet, and they were the wines. They were fashion, right? So like anything, there's the storytelling version of the product, and then there's the actual history, and all commercial wines, they want to appeal to the market, and the market wants more dry, they go more dry, they want more. But so all of that said, but sweetness in wine is part of the human condition. It's right
I
and proper at times. Um,
I always wonder
So
whether the people who are, it's the people with the voice, like the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
yeah,
I
juice, yeah.
I wonder whether the squeaky wheels within the wine industry, who have the ear of the wineries, are the people who are saying, oh, I don't want any sweetness, or I want a lot of acidity. And the trouble is,
Really.
then the market is really not not attuned to that. I kind of wonder with consumers, a little bit of residual sweetness goes a long way to convince people that wine is something that's reasonable for them. Where I'm hearing, like, a lot of people will say to me, "Oh, I don't drink wine. I don't drink wine. I have a cocktail, but I don't drink wine."
Uh,
And 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 it's totally because of this, because I think of wine as being some acidy, non-sweet.
well, I think it's a mix. There's some of it is because the wines that they're told they're supposed to love, they don't love. Right? It's
Right.
not. It doesn't fit the flavor. And I think a lot of it also is the the sense that to be into wine requires uh, sort of an intellectual commitment.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's a beverage, like Coke
Hundred
or
percent.
seltzer,
100%.
and particularly wine professionals lose sight of this all the time. Um, and it's I get it. I'm not blaming anyone. A wine geek shouldn't feel bad about being a wine geek either.
100%. Yeah.
But the pretentiousness factor keeps a lot of people away. Um, Again, it's across the wine world. In the film world, uh, perhaps even more so. Right? There's plenty of people when they're done either with their professional jobs or yeshiva or whatever. Like they don't want another graduate level course just to be able to have wine with their meal. Um, and whiskey, in fact, all the spirits are so much more approachable in that sense because you don't it's like I've tried to explain this to people in slightly different contexts, mostly my wine geek friends, when they say, in wine speak, when you say, oh, it's very approachable. So to a non-wine person, they'll look at you funny, like
Like, what does
it's
that
a,
mean? It's a
it's
liquid.
like
You drink it.
it's a
What do you mean? It's got to melt? Like, what are we
right.
talking about?
What does that mean, approachable? You
Yeah.
pour it, you drink it, and sometimes wine geeks, when you ask them about it, like they kind of go into this reverie of and all the kind of the nomenclature pops up, and it comes out as gobbledygook to the uninitiated. And I always try to explain that, look, the uninitiated, that's the market, right? You want to sell not to wine geeks, you want to sell to people, normal human beings.
Right.
Wine, it's just like food, because it's food.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be part of everyday life. To me, a successful wine, when I say it's approachable, it means you don't have to have ever tasted anything like it before to enjoy it. You don't have to. It doesn't have to age for 20 years in a cellar before it's just coming into its. A good wine that fits all the different categories. It's refreshing. The alcohol is just enough to make you happy, but not enough to where it's burning or
Yeah. Where it feels hot.
remarkable. Ultimately, you want a wine that isn't where no one element is remarkable. You just want it where you go, "Ooh, that's nice,"
Yeah.
or "yummy," or whatever. That's really what you want in a wine. The wine geeks will, like me. I mean, I'm a self-confessed wine geek of the highest order. I'll sit there and ooh and ah for 20 minutes over this element of that, but I'm not going to bore anyone else with it unless they're into it. For anyone else, I'll just say, "Oh, it's really nice." And so approachable wine means it's good drinking right now. Pop and pour. If it's not pop and pour, then it's not yet approachable. It's as simple as that.
Right.
And so like the one thing about the KFWE style tastings, and again, this is as true in the Trafe market.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if
When
there's a difference. Is there a notable difference between the kosher market and the trafe market?
Yes.
with return to how they're approached, but also consumer behavior,
The
price
whole variety of
points,
different.
trends.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
whole variety of differences. So just to finish the thread
yeah.
of the
Go ahead.
KFWE style tastings. So the two things that I find, or the three things I find sort of annoying about tasting in that context is many wines, particularly as you go higher up the quality spectrum, they're released to market early because they need a return on the investment. But the wines, in many respects, do need time and bottle before they're really ready to drink. So that style tasting traditionally is a trade tasting, not a public tasting, because the trade understands that, oh, right, we lay down stocks of this, and in 4 years' time, we'll sell that, or, whatever. 2 years' time, depends on exactly what you're tasting. But there'll be some wines that you bring to market and instantly move off the shelf, and others that are for the people who are building their cellars out and need a little bit more of this or that region. And it's the understanding that, lay it down for 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, because right now it's not pleasurable. When punters, when consumers come in, they're expecting, I think quite rightly from their vantage point, right? They just spent X amount, $100, £100, whatever. Like, I want to taste the best of what you got right now. And usually they're very disappointed because the most expensive wines aren't ready to drink right now, even though it's being offered right now on the table. A. B. At home, people will be drinking it with food and friends as part of a meal, right? All good wine fits into a meal. It's part of cuisine at table. It's part of everything. And to just taste, walk around and go, oh, we get a taste of that. It's ink,
Yeah,
right? Or it's not, it needs more time. It's not yet totally together. And so even if a consumer can instantly recognize, oh, it's a quality wine. It's all the different elements, even if it's just enough to recognize that. But at the end of the day, it's not ready to drink now. So it's still an unsatisfying experience for a lot of people. In the kosher market, it's a little bit worse, only because depending on the level of frumkeit, a lot of people are coming in and they're thinking kiddush. Can I glug back 4 ounces in one sitting of this, right? Will this give me pleasure when I consume arbeicosis and I'm just downing it out of a silver becher, even if they're upscale, use a glass becher. Well, a lot of wines don't work at that level. Try chugging a Coke in a whole can of Coke in 30 seconds. It's not so pleasurable either.
yeah,
um, there are wines that do that and that do it very well, but it's a slightly different context, and it's one of the things about the kosher market that people outside the kosher market don't get professionally, and I think people within the market sometimes lose sight of. Um, and kosher consumers often feel like they're being not cheated is a little bit strong, but feel like it's at their expense. They sort of recognize that it's their captive audience, right? They need kosher, they can't drink not kosher. So there's always a sense, same in restaurants and other, where people are like, well, there's no competition. That's why we're stuck with this. That's why the pricing is this. Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of silly notions that people have in their heads about what things ought to cost. At the end of the day, everything is market forces. Doesn't mean that there isn't things that are priced too high, but or too low in some instances. But usually the people who are coming up with the pricing, they're trying to figure out A, how to make a profit, but B, how to not lose their shirt. So there's a little bit of guesswork, but it's still, at the end of the day, it's all still market forces. It's at that part's no different. More competition would help improve the dynamics of the price structure, but the basic dynamic is the same. But so a lot of people come in and think, oh, I'm stuck, having to pay 4 times the price of the non-kosher version of this wine, and it's just because I'm trapped because I keep kosher. And I'm like, no, that's in most instances the markup is a reasonable maybe 40% because it costs more to do.
Right.
It costs more for the winery to do, a lot more in some instances. It's just as a quick aside. We mentioned earlier Drapier Champagne. I recently had a nice conversation again with Michel with an article I was doing on champagne. So I asked him, so what are some of the technical differences in, because they've been doing it now for however long, a decade plus, 20
Yeah.
years, something like that. Right? They've been doing it a long time already.
Yep.
And it's a regular thing. So I said, like, how much kosher do you produce relative to your non-kosher? So he says, it's different every year, depending on quality, depending on the market, demand and whatever. He says, so in any given vintage, they could be doing 0 kosher bottles to up to 30,000. So okay, so let's say
How is
30,000
30,000 compared to the rest of what they make, though?
So that's what I asked him.
Yes.
So he said, like, on average in any year, they're non-kosher, they do 1.5 million.
Wow.
So 30,000 with a tremendous, he said like all the economy of scale is lost, all the efficiency is lost. So a winery that normally produces 1.5 million, the exact same infrastructure has to separately, and it has to be fully separate, independent, is now doing a tiny run of 30,000. So you can imagine what the costs are.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
and for a quality producer, they demand that the mashgichim have to be on hand, ideally as readily available
All
as
the
with the
time.
non.
Yeah.
And so, you can't always, there's only so many people doing it. So there's always, well, not always, but there's usually, you have to kind of balance that out. Plus, there's Shabbos and Yom Narayim. And so like, there's a variety of other factors that delay the seamlessness, or distance the seamlessness, potential seamlessness of the kosher run from the non-kosher run. But if the guy, if you're say in Champagne and the guy's coming up from I don't know, Strasbourg or Lyon or wherever, you got to wait for him to show up before you can pull the sample, before you can adjust this, before you can adjust that. And if you've ever driven around France, you get stuck in traffic and there's another delay. So like people have to. It's one of those areas where an all kosher winery has it all over a non kosher winery in terms of the process and the efficiency
and scale. Yeah.
The downside is it's often the best terroir is multi-generational, established, which means not kosher. Right? It means not Jewish. It means so often the non-kosher wineries have better fruit at their disposal, but it's offset by the fact that the economics of it are upside down. Whereas an all kosher place, the economics of the production are in line with the industry, but if they're an estate winery, it's just what they own, and if they're not a state, or if they also buy, it's what the market, what they can afford to get and what they're able to get. Even in Israel, it's not unusual if you're not an estate winery for your long-term contracts to be underwhelming. Where the grower goes, even though we signed for this, I cut. They won't tell you I cut a deal with somebody else for cash. They'll tell you, oh, yields were low this year.
Yeah. Yes.
It is what it is.
And we should actually, because yields were low, you should actually pay me more because it's more concentrated product.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, it's really
everyone's trying to make a living. But anyway, so in the kosher market, so there's all those aspects to it, and consumer behavior is different. Now, the other thing that about the kosher market, at the end of the day, Yidden need wine, halachically wine, meaning grape juice too, but something that is yayin. They need yayin. They need it every single week. At a minimum, they need it for Kiddush, Havdalah. So for some, grape juice is fine, either because they like the taste, they don't want the alcohol, for health reasons, for lifestyle reasons. young kids, whatever it is. Although I give my young kids wine,
Me too.
but whatever. But Jews need the product, and I've often said, at the end of the day, in the mainstream world, wine is a luxury item. In the Jewish world, wine is a necessity. Good wine is a luxury item, and it makes a big difference. So it means that if somebody is budget constrained, and most Jews are, lots of, God willing, many children, and that costs money to raise and educate, and so all the different competing elements of a family budget. Unless both all the elements that control the budget, the husband, wife, and anything else, unless they're on the same page, and or the disposable income allows whoever's making the purchases to quietly bump it up anyway. But otherwise, it has to be sort of a family decision that we're going to drink at this level, not that level. So there's plenty of people who, as much as they would love to drink, $300 bottles of wine on a Shabbos, that's just not an option. It's just not realistic. And so everyone is always looking for the cheapest possible wine that they'll enjoy. So depending on their palates, that means that they have to spend over, say, I don't know, $20, $25 just to get something that they can drink. In the trafe world, there used to be $2 chuck, but it was not all wines that were competitive at that price level were any good. $2 chuck was considered just drinkable enough. Right? Kosher, there's no such thing as a $2 chuck. The closest thing would be $5. There's not a lot of that at that price point either, but but Trader Joe's in America, you can start to get for under $10. You can find things. Most kosher wines under $10 are at the quality level of the competitors of $2 chuck, so not very good. There are some exceptions, but so when you're at that price point, to drink a Cabernet that retails in the kosher market for $9.99 may or may not give you the same pleasure as Bartonura Moscato, which, depending on your exact market, you're either getting discounted at $10 or you're spending maybe $14. Again, depends on the exact market. Yeah. But so you're comparing something that you can absolutely drink, not remarkable necessarily, depending on your taste preferences, but everyone will, it's not like Manischewitz wine with them. They'll get something out of it. Yep. Versus a dry red that at that quality level maybe isn't really what you want. So the price sensitivity is high, and it leads to big gaps between people who aren't willing to spend more than their usual budget because it's unfamiliar territory, and they're not, if they're buying wines at that price point, it's usually for a reason. So in the mainstream market, even in the Goyish market, right? Why convincing the average drinker to spend more than $20 or 20 quid in Britain is a huge jump, right? Most of the wine that gets sold is at the cheaper end. 20 is considered sort of premium, right? Certainly in the UK, but even in America, mainstream 20-25 is kind of the first jump to premium. In the kosher market, that's like nobody thinks of it as premium because you think, oh, that's where it gets drinkable. Again, partly it's just because kosher costs a little bit more to produce. Kosher Israeli wines have to be exported out of Israel, brought into America. There's costs involved in that. So all Israeli wines are that much more expensive in America or in the UK. Often just removing whatever competitive advantage in terms of price structure domestically in Israel, that evaporates the moment, because import-export, it's just there's more costs involved. Not fully evaporates, but, that cuts into the margins of how people think of these wines. the mavushal aspect also changes, particularly for Israeli production, because often the stuff that they make mavushal for export a little bit different because they're a little bit further removed from the chain of customers being able to relate back, this didn't taste right or this wasn't, so sometimes the mavushal quality coming out of some of the larger wineries in Israel isn't quite as good as the same version that you can get locally.
Yep. You mentioned, though, that some of the French ones have a mavushal and a non-mavushal, and you've
Yes.
tasted those. What do they taste like? What's the difference? Is there a difference?
So it varies a little bit. Some of the wineries have. So I've come to understand this is like a technical issue, but many of these wineries, it's small production. They so that even within their own, like thermal processing of wine is a long-standing thing. Almost all commercial wineries of any uh, proper size have had experience with it. Not mavushal temperatures, right? That's a whole nother kettle of fish. But just the idea of using heat in judicious, technical ways to deal with a difficult vintage. Not all of them are familiar, but many, many, many are familiar. They all kind of hate the idea, just because it's heat. So it's not what the it's not it's it certainly doesn't keep with the narrative they tell customers, but they're familiar. But to do it at a scale and with the rigorous protocol involved in kashrus is a kind of a different order. Some wineries you can't get the equipment easily. Sometimes you can't even get it to the facility easily. In some cases, you have to truck the liquid just a little bit. It just depends on where things are set up.
Right.
When mashkiach is being mavashal the wines, a heavier touch versus a lighter touch. So that even though there's a particular temperature you need to get at for, la halacha, it doesn't mean that you're not getting well over that at times because, I'm not regulating it the way I should. Obviously, no one's going to share that with anybody. The people producing it know what's going on, but they're not going to share that with customers and say, "Oh, well, the first 20,000 liters it went about 10 degrees hotter than we wanted." But, so like there's some things. It is what it is, and they have to make the best of it. And so they'll try to blend it out, or things. So some wineries, their mavushal versions really aren't the same quality level. In some cases, they will be, right? It means like the first time that Capsanis in Spain did some mavushal wines, I think virtually everyone agreed they weren't as good. There was a real qualitative difference. You can taste them back to back, and it was like something in the wine had changed, and not for the good. And that's a learning curve. A couple vintages in, they get it. Usually. So there's that aspect to it. And again, it's all very technical. From a consumer perspective, at the end of the day, all you know is you drink it and it tastes good or it doesn't taste good. It tastes like you expect or it doesn't taste like you expect.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You're kind of in a focal point of the global markets between having France and having the U.S. and having Israel and some of the other outlying producers. Is there currently a leader in the kosher wine industry? Is it Israel? Is it the U.S.? Is it Europe? Is it another region?
Oh, right. It's a good question. So it depends a little bit on what the focal point is. So in terms of sheer numbers, the largest number of all kosher wineries is Eretz Israel.
Yeah.
Which frankly I find appropriate.
Yeah.
I think that's the way it should be. Yeah. As a quick aside, when the late Daniel Rogav in one of the iterations of his book on his first one of that was just kosher wines, not Israeli wines, kosher wines. I wrote a review for the LA Jewish Journal, in which I was a bit critical. I mean, he's a good guy, it's a good book, but I said, like, the percentage of Israeli wines isn't as high as it ought to be for the market in a book that's about global kosher wine. And as you know, there's many more kosher wines from Israel than was reflected in the book. And he said, well, I already have a book on Israeli. And I said, but you're missing the point. To a kosher consumer, right, they want to know about kosher wines as a whole. And so it should be better represented. So that just as a quick side note. One of the things that I feel very strongly, I think a lot of people don't grasp about kosher wine. A lot of Jews don't grasp. Kosher, we speak of kosher wine in terms of kashrus because within the trade, it's kashrus supervisors who are doing it, right? Who are involved in it. Halachically, it's machal asura, so we think in terms of kashrus, and it is conceptually at that level, at the technical level, but really it's not kashrus in the way that ingredients into this or that processed food are kosher. It's not quite the same, right? It's not manufactured in quite the same way. It's much more of a natural product. There are, additives and, make sure the yeast, if you're using commercial yeast, there's a handful of things, but ultimately it's an agricultural product. Really the difference between kosher wine and stam yenam, right? General wine, non-kosher wine, isn't really kashrus. It's really Yiddishkeit. It's Jewish identity. What is kosher wine? It's Jewish wine, right? Historically, what was the reason for the gezerah of stam yenam? It's not yayin nesach. That's distinct. Hashem doesn't want us to have wine that's been used for avodah zarah. That's its own isser. It's an isser d'oraisa. The reason why stam yenam, right, wine about which we don't know if it was used for nesach, why it's forbidden, is because chassidus. They don't want the sages didn't want Jews in that social situation with non-Jews. It's about separation. It's us and them. So kosher wine is really Jewish wine, right? That's the distinction. So, in terms of the rules of, the technical rules of kashrus, we live in an age in which most Jews aren't shomer Shabbos, they're not shomer mitzvahs, in the way that used to be, in the certainly in the biblical period, but certainly in the Talmudic period, you were either Jewish, which meant you were of the community, regardless of your exact level of religiosity, you were Jewish. There was only one definition. It was before there was the different, reform and centuries or millennia before all that, millennia plus. So it was identity, Jewish, not Jewish, and to be a Jew who's outside Jewish was a whole different thing. So wine was Jewish wine. So it's different from shechita. It's different from modern food processing. So in an era now where many Jews can't make Jewish wine in a halachic sense, right? They need to hire workers who are shomer Shabbos, but before the kashrus industry had certifications that for which you rightly need to pay because it's a job, someone has to do it. How'd you know something was kosher? Because Yosela, the butcher, he lives there and he's part of the community. He's kosher, right? The meat's kosher because he's a trustworthy yid. How'd you know this wine was kosher? Because he's in the community. It's Jewish wine. He's making Jewish wine. So like before kashrus became an industry, and again, this is all a proper natural evolution,
Progression,
right? It's a progression, and it is right and proper. I know people complain all the time about it. It's a job, and it's a difficult job. Dealing with Yidden is always a difficult job.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, right? So kosher wine is really much more about the identity of Jewish wine. And it's just as a technical matter, la halacha, that means Shomer Shabbos. That means, folks of the community. And then there's a politics, Heimish versus Liz versus that, etc. But so Israel, by rights, should all be Jewish wine. I mean, all the Israeli wine, right? I mean, again, Palestinian wine if you're there, whatever. But commercially, it's all Jewish wine. It's not all kosher because of the technicalities of, what constitutes kosher certification. But so to me, and I understand many Israelis, this isn't what they want to hear, and it's not their approach conceptually. That's fine. No one has to agree with me. I'm just saying historically, that's what kosher wine is. So it therefore becomes a bit weird at times when kosher, when the best kosher wines are coming from non-Jewish wineries. It's the nature of the market that somebody swooped in and convinced them to do Jewish wine. But a ninth generation French winemaker who, historically, if they had any interaction with Jews before the modern era, was not positive. Even if certainly post either during the war or post-war, maybe it's very positive, but historically probably wasn't great. So on the one hand, it's a Kiddush Hashem that now you can go and get the highest levels of kashrus from people who wouldn't know don't know from Jews otherwise. And in many respects, that's a Kiddush Hashem, and it's a wonderful thing. You're being Mekadesh something, you're bringing it into the fold. On the other hand, it's not Jewish wine. You're creating Jewish wine in a totally totally non-Jewish environment. And there's a cost, right? There's a greater cost. So in terms of leadership in the wine world, so it depends on sort of what you're looking for. As I say, the most number of kosher wineries is in Israel, which I think is appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a leadership sense of when Israel is exploring new varieties. That's, I think, exciting. In the indigenous variety. Not that all are equally good, but it's an exciting development. Certainly at the wine geek level, even non-Jews get very excited about indigenous varieties in Israel or Cyprus or Greece, because it's different from Cabernet and Merlot. And as much as they love all wine, when it's different and it's a foreign sounding grape to them, that's just exciting. Full stop. Whether it's any good is the next question. But so that's an exciting development. Wine geeks who are more academic are especially excited by some of the archaeological wine research about how Vitis vinifera came onto the scene, and it turns out the Levant is also not just Georgia. Depending on one's level of geekery, This is brilliant stuff. So there's all that. So there's there's unbelievable talent in Israel. But what Israel lacks is, as you know, is better than I even, I'm sure, is the traditions, right? Because outside of a couple of families, before Bedinat Yisrael, there was no wine in any traditional sense. It's not like in France where there's 9 generations, cultivating the exact same grape in the exact same plot, and so they, it's not like that, right?
It's a little different, though. Wait, I want to correct you. It's not like there wasn't. 2,000 years ago, there are gots all over the place. You almost can't throw a stone in the Judean hills without hitting a got. But but there haven't been Jews here for that. There's a big space where we were
there's a big
pulled
gap.
out.
So
Gullus
brought to an end a terrific amount of the continuity of Jewish life. Right? That's the nature of Gullus. And so that's what I mean by a tradition. Not that the history is not there; it's the
recent tradition, right? Where you've got a grandfather and a great grandfather and what have you. Right. I mean, the Herzogs have this living tradition. That's like
Yeah.
12 generations, and
That's right.
it's amazing. I mean, but it's very rare, but they do. I mean, we've got some families here that are 2 and 3 generations into it in Israel,
Right.
but it's not like we've been living on the same land with the same vines for the last 900 years.
Right.
It's yeah.
Now, all of that said, there's also this is where the sort of the stories wine people like to tell themselves. There's a disjuncture, right? Uh, a lot of the great wines of the world um, went through terrifically long periods of mediocrity. In some cases, unbelievable mediocrity, and even unbelievable vineyards. Chateau Aubryon, right? Samuel Pepys mentions it in his diary in the 1600s, and so for sure that plot of earth has always been, special. But the wines coming from that plot of earth have not always been correct because until the modern era in which wineries estate bottled, right? It was negociants buying barrels and bottling it themselves, and often they were doctoring it because there's no
Yep.
regulation. They do what they want. So in France, famously, there's lots of these stories of fraud and legal and illegal, right? Because again, it was pre-regulation in some respects, certainly before the AOCs, and that's why a lot of this stuff came about, was to protect these things. So the also the science of wine, pre Louis Pasteur and post Louis Pasteur, is you know like a Copernican revolution, and since Pasteur, the science and understanding is just leaps and bounds. So in that, you can now make technically brilliant wine virtually anywhere in the world. So yes, it may be a place that didn't know viticulture till yesterday, so to speak. I mean, in relative terms, Japan, they had pre 1950s. I don't think there was a lot of wine, but they're exploring and doing interesting things. China, there's plenty of places that don't have any natural long history of wine, but can be doing excellent things. So does it mean that therefore a wine that in historical terms was created yesterday versus the 12th generation or whatever, does it mean that they're qualitatively better or worse? It's a subjective judgment, but in many respects, no. It's the person who's been farming the same plot of land for generations. They make better wine now than they ever made before,
Yep.
because the kids, the people doing it are educated in the scientific terms. So Israel has an edge that way, where on the one hand, yeah, a lot of there's a break in the continuity of tradition, and so a lot of indigenous and all that kind of stuff is gone. We don't really know what styles and whatever, but ancient wine tended to be, by contemporary standards, dreck, right? Too
Yep.
sweet, and your resin, all the stuff they would use to doctor it. So different kettle of fish. So I think there's a degree to which that it's an unnecessary story, but it's a trapping because the wine world, the mainstream wine world, likes to tell these
Stories.
multi-generational stories.
Stories, right.
So again, in terms of leadership, so Israel, I think, is where some of the most exciting stuff is happening. The Herzog family, we mentioned it a few times. It's not appreciated by some because it's commercial. It's people are always complaining about pricing and whatever. The Herzog family has done more than any other commercial enterprise, commercial group, to push the quality of kosher wines in the right direction. They're doing it for commercial reasons, right and proper, right? But it's hands down, but for them, uh, the industry would be nowhere near as advanced as it is. Um, they're not the only ones, but they're by far the market leaders in this. And so it's leaps and bounds. we would be so far removed from quality wines, but for them, and even the people who, independent of them, are pioneers, the Ernie Weirs and people who are really unbelievable vignerons. If the wine is excellent but nobody can get it, the impact will be minimal, right? So distribution is an important part of all this. And again, in storied parts of France, again, nobody people don't think of the commerce side of it. Why did one region do better than another? Because the trade route or the train or, things that allowed them to get to market. So if the greatest product in the world doesn't have an audience for distribution reasons, the actual impact on the market will be next to nothing. So that can be a tremendous drawback. Right now, in terms of like sheer quality, probably the absolute top of the market, me personally, I think, is Domaine de Monti. Etienne de Monti and his wines, exceptional. The terroir he's working with, unbelievable. The market, the distribution of the wines is pretty minimal, so the market exposure is pretty minimal. But there's terrific importer in Israel. They're just kind of reconfiguring their setup in America. Honest Grapes, you've had Nathan on.
Nathan's amazing.
And Nathan, it was basically his. He and his partners, it was their pet project to get the thing going. I think the Monti came to him, but they're the ones who made it. They already had a long-standing relationship with the Monti. I've had long conversations now with the Monti where, over the years he was approached about kosher, and his Israeli importer of his non-kosher told them, don't do it, it'll ruin the brand. And, 20 years later, it's a different story. And so he's finally dipped his toes in, and it's just, it's unbelievable quality and complexity and just amazing wines. His approach to how he insists on doing his kosher is the right approach, but it's expensive. But that's, like if you can't have the mashgiach exactly when you need them, accepting only Shabbos and Yom Tov, otherwise you're not doing it, right? Yeah. I'm not waiting a week for the guy to show, like that's not going to happen. So that's the correct approach, but you pay for that privilege. So there's a whole variety. So again, if the wines don't succeed commercially, the Monti will stop doing them, and the impact on the market will be minimal. So there's success. There's in many ways to chalk it up, but
the market controls.
But the talent, we've never had such great talent in the modern era. The guys in Israel across the board, some amazing stuff. Ernie Weir, Jeff Morgan, Jonathan Haydu, David Gazignado, and the whole Herzog operation, California, and then what they're doing, Menachem Israelovich in Royal Wines Europe, Pierre, I think still does a couple of French wines.
He does. So he does a bunch actually. He actually got back into it, bringing wines to Israel during the Shemitah year. He made some interesting wines in France and brought them back to Israel, so that they were non-Shemitah. Are there any Israeli wines that really, stand out in your mind? So
I find across the board the Recanati wines, I think, I've always liked Recanati from Louis Pasco's days forward. But I feel like they get better all the time. Yeah. And they were good. They were great to begin with. They get better all the time.
By the way, there's a new Odem. It's called, Odem, a Merlot from Recanati. It's from their Odem vineyard, and it's awesome, and it's a Merlot, and it's just an awesome Merlot coming out of Israel. So I'm just telling you, it's an interesting product.
There's some people who are doing amazing things. Look, so Dalton, I've always been a fan of Dalton. I think they do. I mean, Kol HaKavod, the pioneers, they helped dramatically transform, the region in terms of tourism and wine. They're true trailblazers. They've had, as it happens, they've had a terrible war. I mean, no one has a good war, but they've had a terrible war.
Right.
But they, I think they have some amazing wines. The Asufa series, which is the plaything
It's
of
so much
guys.
fun. It's so much fun.
I love it.
I know it's so much fun. There's some of us in the I'm including myself with some stellar people, but there are a number of people who have like put themselves in a box that they almost don't like anything except this specific
Correct.
product.
Right.
I've tried to keep my mind a little bit more open, and I try to taste things. I don't always love some of them, but I can
Right.
see how the market would react positively towards it, and how it could be an entry drug to the to the wine industry, where to expect somebody who's going to pick up a bottle of Smith Haute Lafitte that's 2020 and you're selling it at like whatever price, and these people pick it up and they taste it and they go, oh, you know what? Wine's not for me. I'm going to go back to cocktails. It
goes back to the premiumization, the categories of price categories. As Louis Pascoe once told me for an article I did, he said at the end of the day, very few people go into wine to be rich. That's not why they went into it. And he's 100% correct. And doesn't mean that there aren't rich people who get into wine, and it doesn't mean there aren't people who got rich through wine.
Yeah.
But that's not the norm.
Right. It's not the wine that did it. It's the.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, so again, for Smith Haute Lafitte, or some of these are in relative terms the playthings of the rich.
Right.
Bordeaux has always had, this Burgundy that's more recent, but it certainly has it now. It's important to ensure that you have correct, or correct is I hate the long phrase, that you have adjusted expectations for human nature, right? In theory, it'd be great for every wine lover to be enamored with Smith Haute Lafitte. I'm sure Smith Haute Lafitte would love it, right? If every wine sold out in seconds. But that's not practical, right? Four Gates, everything sells out more or less in an hour. But there's not much of it, right?
Yeah,
and it's not full pace. So, some of the larger wineries, particularly some of the middling price points, get a bad rap. Because, if you're a Smith Haute Lafitte drinker, and that's your budget, those are the types of wines you drink, a Barcon Classic is not going to rock
make it for you. Right.
It's just not going to work for you. That doesn't mean that it's not a good wine. It's not being made for you in that sense, right? Their target
100%.
audience, right? And so there has to be, there has to be an adjustment to how people speak about this. The wine world is co-opted. The wine literature, shall we say, the wine buzz, is co-opted by the people who have the time and interest. People like me, although hopefully I'm a force for good to the degree that I have any impact at all. It's tiny. But that I'm bored senseless when people only want to discuss sort of the super expensive snob appeal things. Even though, if I have the budget, those are my wines, right? but the reality
You're
is,
an honest man. You're an honest man. Right? It's good. It's good.
But if I'm trying to convince people to incorporate wine into their lives, what kind of a schmuck would I be if I say, here's a wine you'll never afford, you'll never want to have, but taste it, you'll love it. Great. Now everything doesn't taste right now. Why would I do that? Why would I take away someone's pleasure? I think it's a silly thing to do, and there's a good chance that the trophy wine, the playthings of the middle class and upper class, aren't going to rock the world of the people who just because it's it's too different. If you're a fast food burger kind of guy, you know,
Beer.
the the very delicate entrecote steak probably isn't as satisfying.
Right.
If you had it, every once a week, you'll develop a taste for it, and suddenly you'll, like everyone else, go, "Oh, they don't cook it as well as these guys." But if you're a fast food kind of eater, which just by the economics, a lot of people are, you have to develop a taste for things that are outside of that.
So thank you for being on the Kosher Terroir, and I look forward to talking to you again very
Thank
soon.
you for having me. This was my great pleasure, and I hope this will be even remotely satisfying to other people. But I had a great time.
I think it will be. It's fun. If you have fun, it communicates. This is Simon Jacob again, your host of today's episode of the Kosher Terroir. I have a personal request. No matter where you are or where you live, please take a moment to pray for our soldiers' safety and the safe and rapid return of our hostages. Please subscribe via your podcast provider to be informed of our new episodes as they are released. If you're new to the Kosher Terroir, please check out our many past episodes.